In this film, we're going to take tape delay one step further. Rather than just making it an effect sitting on top of a track, we're actually going to create a new musical part out of a tape delay effect. Before we go any further, let's just hear the track we're going to be working on. Okay, so down at the bottom of this arrangement, we've got these two pulse parts which sound like this by themselves. And it's out of these two parts that I want to create the effect that I mentioned before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Logic's mixer and I'm going to select both of these sounds, this one, and they both select down here in the mixer. And I'm going to send them to a new auxiliary, which is here, and I'm going to call this tape delay. And then what I'm going to do is to insert a tape delay plugin. This is Logic's own, but you can use any tape delay plugin or delay which has the capacity to create regenerating effects. We're going to see exactly what that means in just a second. So what I'm going to do within this tape delay plugin is to just design my delay a little bit. I want it to be playing in quarter notes. That's fine. What I'm going to be doing is automating in a second the feedback level. In lots of delays, you'll find that there's this wonderful place in the feedback amount where rather than feedback creating delay taps that are still sort of fading away, suddenly they begin to regenerate. So above a particular percentage point or a particular point in the sort of balance, there'll be a moment where suddenly rather than delays fading away, they start building up and getting louder. We call that regenerating. And in this particular plugin, that's around 100%. You can see that it goes all the way up to many, many more than that. And those delays will build more quickly, obviously, the higher that number. So we'll come back to that parameter in a second. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to limit the frequency range of these delays. I don't want the bottom end of these sounds to be included. I'm also going to roll out some of the top. But in order to get that sort of characteristic tape sound, what I'm also going to do is to introduce some modulation, some LFO, and I'm also going to be adding some flutter into the sound as well, and I can choose how much of that I want in due course. Because this is an auxiliary effect, I'm going to make sure that the wet balance is 100%, because obviously this is being added separately from the dry parts. And then obviously what I'll need to do is to make sure that for both of these sounds, I'm turning up the auxiliary send on both of them so that the delay is actually being added to both those sounds. So if we solo them for a second so we can hear them both playing, if I run these from the beginning, when we get to the end, we'll begin to hear how this delay builds up. And I'm going to keep the interface open so we can sort of just begin to explore what happens when we start experimenting with the feedback level. So now you're hearing the delay, and if I push this level up, you can hear that very gradually those delays are getting louder. And as I drop the feedback down, then obviously they fade away. So I need to be able to automate that parameter so that I can control exactly how that happens. But you can also hear, as the delays build up, they kind of become a bit more shrill. And you can hear there's modulation in them as well, which is coming from the settings down at the bottom of the plugin, where we're just starting to get some wow and flutter, and we get these kind of interesting artifacts. And it's that I'm interested in. So my next move is to make sure that I'm going into automation mode for this auxiliary so that I can record changes to the feedback level. So I'm going to come back to the beginning and run this one more time, and this time we'll have the whole track running live, and again we'll repeat what we've just done, but this time we're going to print those effects or make them part of this ongoing arrangement by recording some automation data for them. So we're going to come out of solo mode, keep latch mode on so that we're going to be recording those changes, and we'll just run this from the beginning, and the automation line will be added to this track down here. Okay, great. So I'm just noting where I've got to, sort of bar 30. And the reason I'm going to note that is because the next thing I want to do is to print this effect so it becomes a part that I can actually import into my arrangement. So the next thing I'm going to do is to create a sort of bounce of this project so that it's being added to the arrangement so that I've got the resulting audio file available to me. Now you can see that I've actually got a chain of plugin effects on the output channel, which I'm actually going to bypass for a second so that they aren't captured as part of this overall bounce. I'm then going to come into here and press bounce. I'm going to make sure that I'm bouncing a full frequency audio file, and I'm going to add it to the project so it's available to me, and I'm going to call it tape delay. And just press bounce, and it's going to go through and print it. You can hear in this section how the sound is evolving and picking up these kind of really interesting little artifacts. Okay, so what I can now do is to bypass or turn off. I'm going to just turn off the effect sends, and I'm going to bypass the effects return because it's kind of served its purpose. We don't need this anymore. I'm just going to mute that channel. Then what I'm going to do is to reinstate my plugins on the output channel, come over to the audio pool, and I'm going to find that the audio file that I've just printed is here. I'm going to just drag that into Logic, and there it is. Now, of course, I don't need this first section. This is effectively just a mix of the track up to that point. It's from this point onwards, really, that things get interesting. And in particular, actually, a little bit later on, I like the delays when they start getting a bit weirder, which happens a bit later into this bounce. So I'm literally just getting rid of all of this stuff, and I'm just going to bring this back here. And I'm going to run this underneath the main mix and just see how this adds to my project. I'm going to mute it in and out. As we press play, I'll just mute this channel and then I'll introduce it, and we should hear a really interesting effect. Too much to hope it would just be absolutely bang in time. So let's go in and have a slightly closer look at this waveform. Sure enough, we can see where the sort of action areas are. We're not in sync with those, so I'm going to just move this here and make this the new start point. Let's just bring this back to the beginning of the project and make sure that we're sort of in time. So the track starts in bar 2. If I move to the beginning of bar 2, I can just drop that file so it starts in the same place. Okay, so far so easy. Now, of course, what I could do would be to take this sound further and start introducing effects. So I could decide that I wanted this to be a kind of grainy, interesting sound. Alternatively, one thing that might be quite fun would be to put a compressor on this sound. I could set up a sidechain input for it. I'm going to select the kick sound. Then what I'm going to do is just make sure that we're setting up an external sidechain trigger, drop the threshold a little bit, increase ratio, and just see what happens when this sound gets some sidechain compression. So that's nice and it works quite well, but I was thinking about making a kind of more interesting musical part out of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just chop just the first couple of bars of it here, and I'm going to save this sound. I'm going to convert it to become a new audio file, and I'm going to call this tape delay sample. And there it is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a sampler. I'm going to use a Logic sampler here. and we'll assign the EXS24, which is Logic Sampler, to this particular track. And I'm going to create, using this audio file, I'm going to create a new instrument. I'm just going to drag this into this window so that it's available for me to trigger. Now the keynote is going to be C3, but what I want to do is just set a key range around that, which allows me to play this sample lower. So I'm going to set C3 as the upper range. I don't want it to play any faster, so the trigger key is going to be the highest note that I can play. But by dropping the octave down by 2 potential octaves here, what I'm going to have a chance to do is to trigger the sound either 1 or 2 octaves below. So the original's here on C3. Here's the sound an octave lower. And here it is 2 octaves lower. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just save this. And give it a name. There we are, we've got our tape delay sample. And then what I can do is I'm going to mute this sound here, and I'm going to just set up a key. And I'm going to trigger this sound. So we'll start by triggering it on C3. We should get exactly the same sound that we had a minute ago. Going to make it 2 bars long. Turn its velocity up. And then if I loop this, then we'll have what we had before. Okay, so far so good. What I could then do would be to say, okay, well, what does that sound like an octave lower? It's going to be played back at half time now. And that's quite nice. So what we've done here is to make a loop out of a tape loop. And effectively by creating these kind of really interesting little artifacts by allowing ourselves to build up the regenerating delay, limiting the frequency range about it, but in particular adding these kind of modulation elements so that the sound just begins to get a bit wonky, we've got quite an interesting new musical part.